Hi, I'm Dr. Megan Samaraki from Rhode Island College. And in today's office hours video, I want to talk about some of the things I've been thinking about related to empirical data and the empirical way of knowing compared to intuition and issues related to internal and external validity. So, internal validity is our ability to detect cause and effect, to understand a cause and effect relationship, and external validity is our ability to generalize outside of the sample of data that we've collected. And I've been thinking about these things and kind of tossing things around in my head because I'm teaching an upper level undergraduate learning course this semester. And in this course, we are engaging in a lot of discussion about empirical data and conclusions that we can draw, and moving away from intuition and towards empirical data and decision making when it comes to student learning. And it's just really given me a lot to think about. And I think that the viewers of these office hours videos, in particular the Patreon supporters, might be interested in these thoughts. And I hope that my discussion here about these concepts will spark thinking in your heads about these issues. So, in cognitive psychology, we rely on empirical data. We really try to understand how the mind works, how we process information, how we perceive the world around us, how we pay attention to various things, and maybe when our attention or shifting attention fails, how we learn and remember. How we problem solve, how we apply, and so on. And so we use empirical research to build our understanding of these concepts. And so we collect data, and those data should be collected in a very systematic way. We engage in peer review of our journals. And so the idea is that we are building our understanding of how the human mind works. And those of us who are interested in applying this area to education, whether it be the classroom or other types of learning environments, individual student learning, or whatever, those of us that are interested in that take those building blocks of cognition that are based on empirical data and build teaching and learning strategies on top of those. So we say, okay, here's how we know, or here's how the data suggests our minds work. And based on that, here's what ought to produce learning and memory, learning and application, and so on in these various educational settings. We don't want to just base our understanding of learning and teaching strategies on a theoretical application of the cognition building blocks. Those building blocks of cognition are based on empirical data, but we don't want to then extend from the basic understanding of how the mind works to the strategies without further empirical testing. So we test these learning and teaching strategies in an empirical way. We do basic laboratory research that's highly controlled and that lets us determine cause and effect relationships, basically design experiments that have a lot of internal validity. We build our way up in that lab to classroom model, testing the strategies with more applied materials and in live educational settings. We do this in a number of different ways and with a number of different learners and a lot of different types of materials. And from there, we can build up more external validity, our ability to generalize. And as a field, so it's not one individual researcher who's responsible for doing all of this. As a field, we can build up a base of knowledge that's based on empirical data. And so this is the empirical way of knowing. And of course, as a cognitive psychologist and a learning scientist, someone who is interested in the science of learning, I am a very strong proponent of this data-driven process and relying on empirical data. And that is as opposed to just simply relying on intuition. So an intuition way of knowing might be, well, when I repeatedly read, I feel like I'm learning more. My personal experience suggests that I'm learning more because as I'm kind of looking into myself, I'm feeling confident and I'm thinking I'm learning a lot, and so my intuition is that this is correct. um, or my experience is that this is going really well. Or maybe I try practicing retrieval and it feels really bad, and so I say, well, that doesn't feel like it's working for me. I might kind of rely on my own learning preferences if I'm relying on intuition. Okay. And we think of these things as sort of separate. The empirical way is letting the data drive our decision making, and the intuition way is letting our own kind of personal thoughts and experiences drive the learning process and the decision making. But I would argue that we can go too far into the empirical side. I think that we can become too rigid in our requirement of empirical data. And what I mean by that is we could say, well, I let's say, as a professor, I teach my own classes. I could say that in order for me to engage my students in a learning strategy or apply a teaching strategy, there has to be empirical data showing that this exact thing works. I would require that there be a controlled experiment with Rhode Island College students learning upper level psychology in this particular way in order to say that it works. I really would require every variable to be matched to my experience or my specific situation before I will say that there is empirical evidence to support what I'm doing. I think that would be too extreme. We don't have time as a field to test every single scenario. There is something to be said for taking the data that we have and looking at what we know is causing learning. So the cause and effect piece, then knowing what processes are causing learning and what pieces of a strategy need to be there, and then flexibly applying it in other situations. So if I am speaking with instructors who are in helping students prepare for the LSAT. So maybe we've got a bunch of philosophy majors who are also pre-law and they're preparing for the LSAT. If I'm advising those students, I'm not going to say, well, I'm going to look for an empirical article about preparing for the LSAT. And if I can't find one, then I'll say, well, I guess we don't have empirical data to support any of this. I can't make recommendations. I think that would be too rigid. Instead, I would like to look and say, well, we know that, college students at this particular level, university students at this particular level, learn well in these types of situations. And the LSAT is a test. And so it's a standardized test. I have a sense of what that's going to look like. And I can advise the students on how to practice retrieval and specifically say you need to bring the information to mind from memory and not just practice memorization. Don't just practice trying to memorize the answers to specific questions, but rather describe and explain from memory, and then check your notes and check the book and see, where you might have gone awry, and then keep doing that, work your way up. That is an empirical recommendation. It's an evidence-based recommendation, but I don't have evidence that exactly that situation will lead to the outcome I want for exactly those students on exactly that test. At least I'm unaware. Perhaps there is a paper out there. But even if there was, eventually there's going to be a situation where we don't have the exact experiment. And yet, I think we can still make evidence based recommendations relying on empirical data. We just have to think flexibly about the strategies that we are promoting. And because we have studied these learning strategies and what we have from cognitive psychology, allows us to determine cause and effect. And we know what processes are causing learning, either directly or indirectly. Because we have that, I think we can be confident applying the data more expansively than what exactly has been tested. No, certainly we should still continue to test with different populations of students and in different domains. For example, I have a paper out. I have a couple of papers actually, but I'm thinking of one in particular that I published with my PhD advisor, Jeff Karpicki, as the lead author, and some other lab members when I was in graduate school, that shows that the procedure that we tend to use with college students of just writing out what you can remember on a blank sheet of paper doesn't actually promote much learning with fourth graders, at least the fourth graders that we studied. And does that mean that we would have been wrong to apply the data that we had on retrieval practice at the time before that paper to fourth graders? Maybe, but I think if we know what piece is actually causing the learning, it's not just writing on a blank sheet of paper that is causing learning. It's the bringing information to mind, reconstructing it from our memories. We could tell when we were conducting that experiment by looking at the students and the way that they were engaging in retrieval practice that it was unlikely to be leading to learning because the students weren't able to reconstruct from their memories. And we knew that both difficulty and success are important. And while students can learn from quote unquote failed retrieval attempts, there's a limit, and that those effects are smaller and they tend to work in different situations. And so if I was just a teacher in that classroom, if I wasn't the researcher trying to collect empirical data, but if I was their teacher, I probably would have noticed, oh, this isn't working well, and I need to rethink this. I need to reevaluate. And so we do need more and more data. It's good that we collected those data with fourth graders, and it's good that we have a better understanding of guided retrieval and supported retrieval, and that we're testing a lot of different retrieval-based learning activities. But I think that researchers and educators would be making a mistake thinking that we have to have exactly the empirical evidence to support the thing that we're saying, that we can't ever extrapolate beyond those data, because I think that is going to be far too restrictive. And I think that it will take far too much time to test every single situation. And that time could be better spent making links to other disciplines and testing new ideas rather than just the same one over and over with different samples and different materials and so on. There's a space for that, but I don't think we have to test every situation. There is room for us to look at the data that we have and to look at our understanding of what processes cause learning, and based on that information, construct a learning activity that ought to work, and then monitoring that in the classroom, not just relying on intuition, but objectively monitoring that in the classroom. And in that way, we are still making evidence-based recommendations, and educators doing that are still engaging in evidence-based practice. They're just doing so in a way that is flexible, as opposed to rigidly thinking about empirical evidence. This is just what I've been thinking about recently, the balance between saying we know something empirically and the flexible application of that information. And at what point is it no longer based on empirical data? And I think that we definitely don't want to be too rigid